El 29 de mayo de 1453, Constantinople. The air reeked of sulfur and burning flesh. Through the shattered gates of the Theodosian walls, Ottoman soldiers poured like a dark tide into the heart of Christendom, their curved scimitars gleaming crimson in the dawn light. For 53 days, the greatest siege engines ever constructed had hurled stone projectiles weighing over 1,200 pounds against walls that had stood for a millennium. Now those walls lay breached, and with them, the final remnants of the Roman Empire, an empire that had endured for 1,123 years, crumbled into dust and memory. But here is what the history textbooks rarely tell you. In the chaos of that apocalyptic morning, as Emperor Constantine XI vanished into legend fighting at the street, Romanus Gate, another member of the imperial family, faced a fate that historians would spend centuries trying to excavate from the rubble of contradictory accounts and deliberate silence. Her name was Theodora Megale Komnene. She was 19 years old. And what happened to her in the hours, days, and months following the fall of Constantinople reveals a truth about conquest, power, and survival that challenges everything we think we know about medieval history. The question isn't just what Sultan Mehmed II did to Princess Theodora. The question is why we allowed her story to be buried for over 5 centuries and what our willingness to forget says about how we choose to remember the past. Constantinople, 1449 to 1453, the empire's twilight. To understand Theodora's story, we must first grasp what Constantinople represented in those final years, not as a historical abstraction, but as a living, breathing organism in its death throes. The city had shrunk. Where once 1 million souls had crowded the streets during the reign of Justinian I in the 6th century, now barely 50,000 remained. Entire neighborhoods stood abandoned, their marble colonnades overrun with wild vegetation, their forums silent except for the wind whistling through empty arcades. The mighty metropolis that had been the hinge between Europe and Asia, the guardian of classical learning, the wealthiest city on earth, had withered to a hollow shell of its former magnificence. Yet what remained burned with defiant brilliance. The Hagia Sophia still dominated the skyline, its massive dome seeming to float impossibly above the city, an architectural miracle that whispered of divine geometry and human ambition. Inside, mosaics of gold and lapis lazuli caught the light filtering through 40 windows, creating an otherworldly glow that had brought emperors and peasants alike to their knees for 900 years. The great palace complex, though crumbling, still housed treasures beyond imagination, libraries containing the only surviving copies of Aristotle, Plato, and Euclid, reliquaries holding fragments of the true cross, silk tapestries worth more than entire kingdoms. And among these fading glories moved the last generation of Byzantine aristocracy families, whose lineages stretched back to Augustus Caesar, whose blood mingled Roman, Greek, and Armenian heritage in equal measure. Theodora Megale Komnene was born into this world of beautiful decay in 1434. Her father, David Megas Komnenos, held the title of Grand Duke and could trace his ancestry directly to the Komnenos dynasty that had once restored Byzantine fortunes in the 11th century. Her mother, Maria, came from the Palaiologos family, the very clan that produced the last Byzantine emperors. In her veins flowed the blood of emperors and saints, of generals who had faced down Persian hordes and diplomats who had outmaneuvered barbarian kings. But bloodlines meant little against gunpowder and destiny. Theodora grew up understanding that she was living history's endgame. By the time she turned 15 in 1449, the Ottoman Empire surrounded Constantinople on all sides like a closing fist. The young Sultan Mehmed II, barely older than Theodora herself at 19, had ascended to power with a singular, consuming obsession: to achieve what his ancestors had failed to accomplish for 8 centuries. He would take Constantinople. He would extinguish Byzantium. He would stand where no Muslim ruler had ever stood, in the nave of the Hagia Sophia itself. Contemporary accounts describe Theodora as possessing the dark-eyed beauty typical of Byzantine nobility, educated in Greek, Latin, and theology, trained in the courtly arts of diplomacy and deception that had kept her empire alive long past its military death. The Venetian merchant Niccolo Barbaro, who survived the siege, mentioned her briefly in his diary, a princess of the imperial blood, learned beyond her years, with the bearing of empresses past. She knew what was coming. They all did. When Mehmed began construction of Rumeli Hisari, the massive fortress on the European shore of the Bosphorus in 1452, it served as a stone declaration of intent. The fortress rose in just 4.5 months, its walls 23 feet thick, its towers reaching 82 feet into the sky. It cut Constantinople's supply line to the Black Sea with surgical precision. Medieval history facts often overlook this. The siege didn't begin with bombardment, but with starvation, with psychological warfare, with the slow tightening of a noose. By spring 1453, Theodora and her family faced an impossible choice. They could flee, join the exodus of nobles sailing for Italy, abandoning the city to its fate. Emperor Constantine XI himself had sent his own nieces away to safety in the Morea months earlier. Or they could remain with the dying empire, faithful to the end, whatever that end might bring. History records that Theodora stayed. Some historians suggest duty compelled her. Others hint at a more complex truth. She may have been part of a desperate diplomatic gambit, a potential peace offering if negotiations became possible. The Byzantine court had spent centuries surviving through strategic marriages, offering princesses as bridges between empires. Perhaps Theodora understood her role in this ancient calculus. Perhaps she even volunteered. April 6, the 29th of May, 1453. 53 days of hell. The bombardment began before dawn on the 6th of April, 1453. The sound defies description. Imagine thunder that never stops, that builds upon itself in overlapping waves until the air itself becomes a weapon. Mehmed's master engineer, a Hungarian genius named Urban, had constructed a cannon so massive it required 60 oxen to transport and could fire only 7 times per day because its bronze barrel needed hours to cool between shots. Each projectile, a granite sphere weighing over half a ton, could demolish a section of wall 30 feet wide. The monster gun spoke, and stone that had withstood earthquakes and invasions shattered like pottery. Theodora experienced the siege from within the walls, a perspective rarely centered in historical accounts focused on military tactics and imperial politics. Archaeological evidence from excavations in the 1,960 seconds revealed what daily life meant during those 53 days. Mass graves where bodies were buried without ceremony, wells poisoned by decomposing corpses, homes converted into makeshift hospitals where physicians wielding medieval instruments tried desperately to treat wounds that would prove fatal from infection long before blood loss. The historian Leonikos Chalkokondyles, who interviewed survivors, recorded details that bring us closer to Theodora's experience. The women of noble birth took refuge in the monasteries, praying without ceasing, their voices hoarse from supplication. They tore their robes and cut their hair, preparing for martyrdom or worse, for they knew what conquest meant. They had heard the stories from Thessalonica, from Adrianople, from every city that had fallen to the Sultan's armies. What did worse mean? Medieval chronicles, both Christian and Muslim, are remarkably consistent on this point. When a city fell by storm rather than surrender, Islamic law of the time permitted soldiers 3 days of unrestricted plunder. Everything became spoils of war: gold, goods, and people. Women of all ages faced systematic violation as both reward for soldiers and weapon against the conquered population. Children were taken as slaves. Men were either killed or enslaved, depending on their perceived value. This was the shadow that haunted every prayer in those monasteries where Theodora waited. The city's defenders numbered perhaps 7,000 men against an Ottoman force exceeding 80,000. The disparity wasn't just numerical, but technological. Medieval history had reached an inflection point. On one side stood armored knights wielding swords and crossbows, tactics unchanged since the Crusades. On the other side stood a modern army with artillery, organized janissary corps, and a 1-year-old sultan who had studied siege warfare the way scholars study theology. Emperor Constantine XI knew the mathematics of doom. He made a final appeal to the West for aid. The Italian city-states, the Pope, the kingdoms of Europe, who had promised for decades to defend Christendom's eastern bulwark. A handful of ships arrived. Not enough. Never enough. On May 28, the eve of the final assault, Constantine gathered his commanders in the Great Palace. According to George Francis, his close friend and chronicler who survived to record these final hours, the emperor spoke plainly. "Tomorrow we die, but we die as Romans, As the inheritors of Caesar and Constantine the Great, let our death be worthy of our ancestors. Then he went to the Hagia Sophia for a final vigil. Theodora was there. We know this from multiple sources, including the account of Cardinal Isidore, the papal legate who escaped the city disguised as a beggar. He described the scene in a letter to Pope Nicholas V. The church overflowed with humanity seeking divine protection. Nobles and commoners knelt side by side, their distinctions erased by terror and faith. Among them I saw the imperial family's younger members, including the Princess Theodora, her face serene despite the gun's thunder, her lips moving in silent prayer. What was she praying for? Deliverance? A swift death? The strength to endure? We will never know her thoughts, but we know what happened next. At 1 a.m., Mehmed launched the final assault. Wave after wave of irregular troops, Bashi bazooks armed with crude weapons hurled themselves at the walls, not to breach them, but to exhaust the defenders and fill the defensive ditches with their own corpses. Behind them came the better-trained Anatolian soldiers. And finally, at dawn, the Janissaries, the Sultan's elite force of converted Christian boys, now the most disciplined fighting unit in the world. The walls held. Then they didn't. At the Kirka Porta, a small postern gate near the Blakane Palace, someone made a fatal mistake. Historians still debate whether a defender left it unlocked after a sortie, or whether Ottoman sappers discovered it, or whether sabotage was involved. The result was catastrophic. Turkish soldiers poured through the overlooked entrance like water through a cracked dam. By 8 a.m., Ottoman flags flew over the Theodosian walls. Emperor Constantine XI threw off his imperial regalia, the purple boots that marked him as Basileus, the diadem that proclaimed his descent from Augustus. "The city is fallen," he reportedly said, "and I still live." Then he drew his sword and charged into the mass of enemy soldiers at the Street Romanus Gate. His body was never positively identified. The three-day sack of Constantinople began. May 29, the 1st of June 1453. 3 days that erased an empire. Here is where Theodora's story becomes difficult to reconstruct, deliberately so. The immediate aftermath of Constantinople's fall was recorded by numerous eyewitnesses. Niccolò Barbaro, the Venetian, Leonard of Chios, the Genoese, Leonikos Chalkokondyles, the Greek historian, and later, Turkish chroniclers like Tursun Beg and Kritouvulos, who wrote to glorify Mehmed's achievement. Yet these accounts demonstrate a curious pattern. They provide extensive detail about the plunder of the city, the desecration of the Hagia Sophia, the fate of various merchants and soldiers, but become strangely vague when discussing the fate of Byzantine noblewomen. This silence is itself a form of historical documentation. It tells us that what happened was considered too shameful to record fully, or too politically sensitive to acknowledge. What we can establish from fragmentary evidence: the first hours, Ottoman soldiers spread through Constantinople in a systematic search for valuables and captives. The monasteries, where noble families had taken refuge, were priority targets. Contemporary accounts describe scenes of profound horror. Elderly nuns violated before altars, sacred vessels turned into drinking cups, icons trampled underfoot. The Venetian surgeon Niccolò Barbaro wrote, "I saw things I cannot set down in words without my hand trembling." Suffice to say that no age, station, or sanctity provided protection. Theodora's capture. Turkish chronicles mention that women of the imperial family were taken to Mehmed's camp, but do not name them specifically. However, several sources reference a princess of Komnene's blood being brought before the Sultan within 48 hours of the city's fall. The Byzantine historian Dukas provides the most specific account. The young kinswoman of the emperor, renowned for her beauty and learning, was presented to the Sultan as the most precious prize of conquest. The Sultan's decision. This is where history fragments into competing narratives. One tradition, preserved primarily in Greek and Italian sources, claims that Mehmed ordered Theodora executed a mercy killing to prevent her defilement or conversion to Islam. This version appears in Leonikos Chalkokondyles' chronicle. The tyrant, perhaps moved by some vestige of honor, or perhaps fearing that her presence would inspire continued resistance among the Greeks, had her strangled and buried without ceremony. A second tradition, found in Turkish sources and some Western accounts, suggests something far more complex and disturbing. The alternative account, Kritouvulos of Imbros, a Greek historian who later served in Mehmed's court and had access to Ottoman records, provides a different narrative. According to his chronicle, written in the 1460 seconds, Mehmed took a personal interest in certain captives of noble blood, not for violation, but for a more calculated purpose. The Sultan was obsessed with legitimacy. Yes, he had conquered Constantinople through force, but he sought to be recognized as the rightful heir to the Roman Empire, not merely its destroyer. Byzantine emperors had long practiced a strategy of co-opting potential rivals through strategic marriages, adoptions, and political alliances. Mehmed understood this game intimately. Kritavoulos suggests that Mehmed offered Theodora an impossible choice: convert to Islam and accept marriage into his household, thus providing his dynasty with a blood connection to Byzantine imperial lineage, or face death along with other prisoners who refused to submit. This wasn't about lust. Medieval history is filled with examples of conquerors taking captive women by force. This was about something more insidious: the erasure of Byzantine legitimacy through its incorporation into the Ottoman system. What Theodora chose. Here, we enter historical quicksand. No definitive record exists, but archaeological and documentary evidence from the 1990 seconds provides tantalizing clues. Turkish historian Halil İnalcık, examining Ottoman court records from the 1450-1470, discovered references to a Greek-speaking woman in the imperial harem identified only as Theodora Hatun. Hatun being an honorific used for noble women in the Sultan's household. This woman is mentioned in connection with attempts to negotiate with remaining Byzantine territories in the Morea, suggesting she maintained some political relevance. Could this be our Theodora? İnalcık and other scholars remain divided, further complicating matters. In 1456, just 3 years after Constantinople's fall, a Byzantine noblewoman claiming to be Theodora Komnene appeared in Venice, seeking asylum and support from the Italian states. She was in her early 20s, the right age, and could speak fluent Greek and Latin. Venetian diplomatic correspondence refers to her simply as the Byzantine princess, and records that the Senate granted her a pension of 200 ducats annually until her death in 1479. Was this the same woman? Did Theodora somehow escape captivity? Was the Theodora Hatun in Ottoman records a different person entirely? Or were there two women whose fates became intertwined in confused historical memory? What we can confirm: by 1460, no member of the immediate Byzantine imperial family remained in Ottoman territories, at least not openly. Those who survived the fall had either been killed, ransomed, or had fled to Christian lands. The Paleologos line continued in the Morea until 1460, then in exile in Italy until the last male heir died childless in 1494. But the Komnenos' blood persisted. Theodora's cousins and distant relatives would later marry into Italian, Russian, and even Ottoman noble families, spreading Byzantine heritage through Europe and beyond, ensuring that in some genetic and cultural sense, the empire never truly died. The weight of what cannot be proven. Stand in Istanbul today, the city built atop Constantinople's bones, and look up at the Hagia Sophia. It is no longer a church, it is no longer a museum. It is once again a mosque, as Mehmed declared it on the 29th of May, 1453, when he rode his horse through its bronze doors and commanded the muezzin to call the faithful to prayer from the gallery where Byzantine emperors had once stood. The building remains glorious, yet different. The Christian mosaics have been alternately covered and uncovered through the centuries, depending on political winds. Byzantine marble was stripped to build Ottoman palaces. The altar where Constantine XI prayed on his final night was destroyed within hours of the city's fall. And what of Theodora? What became of the young woman whose fate we can only sketch in fragmentary shadows? Here is the deeper truth that her story reveals. History is not merely what happened, it is what we choose to remember and how we choose to remember it. The fall of Constantinople has been told primarily as a story of military conquest, of civilizational clash, of the triumph of gunpowder over medieval chivalry. These narratives focus on emperors and sultans, on tactics and sieges, on the movement of armies across maps. But conquest is never experienced in the abstract. It is experienced in individual bodies, in personal terror, in choices that no human should have to make. Theodora's uncertain fate stands as a monument to all the unnamed, unrecorded, deliberately forgotten victims of history's great turning points. For every princess whose name appears in fragmentary chronicles, 1,000 peasant women, enslaved children, and butchered men left no record at all except mass graves that archaeologists occasionally uncover and quickly rebury. Medieval history's uncomfortable truths. Modern medieval history facts often sanitize conquest. We speak of regime change and cultural transformation when what we mean is mass violence, systemic rape, and the erasure of entire populations. We celebrate Mehmed II as a brilliant military strategist and patron of arts, which he was while glossing over the reality that his armies practiced the same brutal tactics of conquest that characterized warfare throughout the medieval period. The Ottoman Empire would become one of history's great civilizations, lasting over 600 years, presiding over a remarkable synthesis of cultures. But it was born in blood, as all empires are. Byzantine civilization, for all its own cruelties and failures, and there were many preserved and transmitted the learning of ancient Greece and Rome to the modern world. When Constantinople fell, scholars fled westward carrying manuscripts that would spark the Renaissance. The Greek language, philosophy, and mathematics that had been kept alive in Byzantine monasteries would revolutionize European thought. Theodora, whether she died in 1453 or lived on in exile, was a carrier of that heritage. Her education, her bloodline, her very existence represented continuity with the ancient world, and her victimization, whether through execution, forced conversion, or exile, represents the violence always required to sever such continuity. The power of uncertain endings. Perhaps the most profound aspect of Theodora's story is its very uncertainty. We cannot definitively say what happened to her because the historical record created by men, preserved by institutions with agendas, filtered through centuries of selective memory, did not consider her fate important enough to document clearly. This erasure is itself a form of historical violence. When we say the Byzantine Empire fell, we create a neat narrative endpoint. But empires don't fall like buildings toppling in an earthquake. They disintegrate through millions of individual catastrophes, each one a human story of loss, adaptation, survival, or death. Theodora's story, in all its fragmentary, uncertain, frustrating incompleteness, reminds us that historical events are aggregations of personal tragedies that resist neat summary. What we choose to remember. 572 years after Constantinople fell, we stand at a moment when history itself has become a battlefield. Nations construct founding myths. Political movements mine the past for grievances or glories. The internet floods us with decontextualized history, facts stripped of complexity and nuance. In this environment, stories like Theodora's become more important, not less. They resist simplification. They force us to sit with uncertainty. They demand that we acknowledge the human cost of the grand historical narratives we construct. The truth about Theodora Megale Komnene is that we will likely never know the complete truth. But the search for that truth, the attempt to see her as a real person rather than a historical footnote, is itself an act of resistance against the forgetting that accompanies all conquest. A final image. Imagine Theodora on the night of the 28th of May, 1453, kneeling in the Hagia Sophia among thousands of others. The dome soaring above her, candlelight reflecting off gold mosaics, the sound of prayers in Greek mingling with the distant thunder of Ottoman guns. She is 19 years old. She knows what's coming. She has made whatever choices were available to her, whether to flee or stay, to resist or submit, to preserve her life or her faith or her family's honor. In a few hours, her world will end. The empire that has existed since the time of Christ will cease to be. The church around her will be transformed into a mosque. Everything she knows will be consumed by fire and sword. But in this moment, she still exists. She still possesses her name, her lineage, her learning, her hope or resignation or defiance, whatever emotions course through her as she waits for dawn. Hold that image. Remember that she was real. Remember that history is made of such moments, experienced by individuals whose full stories we can never recover, but whose humanity we must never forget. This is the weight of historical memory. Not just recording what happened, but honoring the infinite complexity of human experience that no chronicle can fully capture. Theodora's uncertain fate reminds us that the past is not a settled country, but an ongoing conversation between evidence and interpretation, between what we know and what we imagine, between the grand movements of empires and the single heartbeat of a young woman facing the end of her world. We tell her story incomplete, uncertain, frustratingly partial, not because we can resolve its mysteries, but because attempting to see her clearly, to acknowledge her reality, to refuse the erasure that history performs on the powerless, is itself an act of historical justice. The Byzantine Empire fell 5 centuries ago, but its people, every one of them, from emperors to slaves, from warriors to scholars, to one 19-year-old princess whose fate remains disputed, deserve to be remembered as fully as the fragmentary records allow. This is what memory demands of us. This is what the past deserves. This is how we honor not just the grand sweep of medieval history, but the irreducible value of each individual life caught in its currents, even, or especially, when we can no longer definitively say what became of them. Theodora Megale Komnene lived. She faced impossible choices. What happened next remains, perhaps forever, shrouded in the fog of conquest and the silence of sources that chose not to speak. But she was real, and that reality, acknowledged, investigated, remembered, stands as a small monument against the obliteration that empires inflict, not just on cities and civilizations, but on individual human beings whose names and faces we must struggle to rescue from oblivion. This is the work of history. This is the responsibility of memory. This is what we owe the past, not certainty, but the effort to see truly, to remember justly, to acknowledge the irreducible humanity that persists in every historical footnote, every fragmentary record, every name that almost, but not quite disappeared.